Hello, everyone, and welcome to our customer training webinar. My name's Kristen Thompson. I'm the Director of Customer Education here at Fast Data, and we're really excited for you to join us today for our webinar on user and provider management. So we're going to be covering this topic in detail. You're welcome to use the chat to be able to put in some comments as well. And then just a few reminders for you. We are going to have the recording shared afterwards, as well as slides. With that, I'm going to introduce our presenter for today. Stop sharing my screen. Now, I'm joined by Phil Wagstrom. Phil, thank you for joining us again on this third of our customer training webinar series. And with that, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks, Kristen. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you might be. I'm Phil Wagstrom with the Office of CTO here at Vast Data. And today we're going to talk about how Vast goes through and manages users, how we handle providers, and how we go through and integrate those not only from a data access perspective, but also through VMS from a management, and how we set those up and do role-based access control to allow using those identity providers to integrate into VMS. For administration purposes. So with that, let me go through and I'm going to share out my screen and we will get started going through this. All right. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So we're talking again, as I said, talk about user and provider management. We're going to break things down here a little bit and talk about what we mean when I refer to a provider. From there, we're going to go into how we integrate into Active Directory, how we integrate in OpenLDAP, how we integrate in NIS, how we do user lookups in VMS to go through and confirm that we're getting all the information we need about users. And then we'll talk about integrating this into VMS for administration purposes as well. So let's start out talking about providers and what a provider is and how we utilize them. So, first off, we need to talk about user identity. So within VAST, a user identity is going to identify a particular user. User has different identities. It could be a UID number, could be a SID, could be an S3 access key. So these are going to be, these user identifiers need to be looked up. And we're going to use or refer to as a provider to get that information. So VAST does support multiple identity providers. These can be used in different combinations within the system. We support Active Directory. We support OpenLDAP, and OpenLDAP covers really anything that speaks LDAP. So we can utilize OpenLDAP straight. We can use free IPA. We can use a couple different variations of that. But so long as it speaks LDAP, we can use it. Then also we support NIS. We're talking NIS, been around for quite a long time, not real heavily used in the industry anymore, but we do have customers that use that. And then we'll talk about very briefly about some local users, how you can define local users on the VAST itself. The providers basically are there to consult and validate identities. So some of the providers can be used for authentication of users, specifically Active Directory can be used to help authenticate users. But for the most part, it's used to identify a user, identify the group membership, identify all their characteristics and all their attributes, and help us go through and do mapping across the different protocols within VAST. So what'll happen is that if I come in over SMB, I want to not only know what groups I'm part of within Active Directory, but I also want to get my identifiers for Unix. I want to get my Unix groups and things like that. So we're going to put all those together. So when I try to access data, regardless of where I created it, how I created it, I'm going to have the same access. Within VAST, all the providers that are configured within the system are configured for the particular access we're trying are going to be consulted, even if I'm only doing single protocol, because VAST is designed to be a multi-protocol platform, multi-protocol data platform, and we want to make sure that if you go through and you're accessing things over one protocol right now, you're going to want to possibly eventually add another protocol in there in the future. So the 4 different providers, as I mentioned, are going to be a local provider for local users, Active Directory, OpenLDAP, or NIS. I kind of already explained what some of these are here, but the providers, unlike some other systems that are out there, the providers within VAST are defined at the cluster level. So even before we go through and we create tenants, we create access rules, we're going to define these providers at the cluster level. And then when we start talking about tenancy, we configure each tenant to utilize a different combination of providers. And the general rules for combining providers are going to be something that has access for SMB, which is going to be an Active Directory provider, plus optionally something that provide POSIX attributes like UID numbers, GID numbers. And this could be, we're going to put those together into a tenant to get all the information we want. So your typical combinations are going to be, any single provider alone. So you can definitely define a tenant or make use of just OpenLDAP or just AD or just NIS for that. You could do combinations of both, where you could use Active Directory and OpenLDAP together as to help identify users. And this would be the case where you have your Active Directory environment, and maybe you don't have Unix attributes, but you do have Unix attributes stored in OpenLDAP for users, and we want to be able to make use of both of those to give us multi-protocol access. Or the combination of a local provider and an Active Directory provider plus NIS is very similar. Or we can use a local provider where we can make use of things to do some mappings for users that otherwise would not be represented in one protocol or the other. Again, because these providers are defined at a cluster level, we can go through and we can use a single provider across multiple tenants. So we would have a single Active Directory defined at the cluster level with a single computer object within Active Directory, but that object and that provider could be used across multiple tenants. So we don't have to do multiple joins to the same Active Directory. And the way we handle things like SPNs and instances there is that that object would just have multiple SPN instances for things like Kerberos if need be. So I'm going to kind of iterate through these here. We'll start with OpenLDAP here for integration, and then iterate through each one of those. So with OpenLDAP, like I said, VAST will use OpenLDAP for users and group POSIX attribute lookup. So we're looking for UID numbers and GID numbers, and the group membership options for those. This is something that you don't necessarily need to have if you're using NIS. You're using something that has RFC 2307 attributes in there. So if your Active Directory environment already has these attributes in there, we don't need a separate OpenLDAP provider. But we can use this in combination with AD or in supplemental support for AD to get those. So if you're in the process of migrating users over, you've got some users that have attributes in Active Directory and others that don't, we can utilize a combination of both of those to put them together. And we'll also go through and we'll use OpenLDAP to consult net group information. So if you're not familiar with what a net group is, basically a net group is a defined list of computers that is stored as an object with an LDAP, so that when we go through and we define our host access rules or our host-based access rules, such as which clients are allowed to do read-write, which clients are allowed to use read-only, we can reference a net group rather than having to put in the individual computers or the individual client IP addresses or host names in those host-based access options. So we can make use of all those there. So let's talk about how we go through and how we set these up. So within VAST, very easy to go through and set up. You'll go into the GUI within VAST, go into user management, go into LDAP, and say create a new LDAP, and you'll be presented with a menu to go through and set these up. We'll talk about what each one of these fields are. So the first one is that, hey, we need to go through and provide a URL or a listing. We need to tell the VAST cluster where the LDAP servers are that we're going to use. And we're going to use two different prefixes for this. We're going to use LDAP : / if we're going to be going through and utilizing this LDAP server to query it either as unencrypted or using TLS. If we're going to be doing something like LDAP-S, which is a little different connection protocol, TLS connection means that you go through, you connect up unencrypted and say, do a start TTLS transaction, and that everything from there will be encrypted. The LDAP-S starts the initial connection encrypted for that. They are both considered secure. VAST does support both of those. The main difference here is that LDAP runs on port 329. LDAP-S uses port 636. for that. But we can specify one or the other for these. We can put multiple LDAP servers in this listing here if we do have multiple redundant LDAP servers there. So we'll provide the URL for that particular connection or those connections that we wish to use. We'll define which port we wish to go through and use, and then we'll go through and also define a domain name that we wish to use for this. Now, LDAP in itself does not necessarily require a domain name. It's typically not used. But if you're using NFSv4 and you want to set that NFSv4 domain name, this is what the NFSv4 domain name would be used for if you're using LDAP here in this case here. So we'll select that. Then we also need to provide a bind DN. So we're going to assume that you're going to have to provide some authentication, or your LDAP server is expecting some authentication. So we're going to ask for that here. There is an option under advanced to go through and change this so that you don't necessarily provide a bind DN if you're going to do anonymous authentication. But the default setup, the most common one, is it's going to ask for this here for this. So you provide your bind DN. This is going to be in your DN syntax, so CN with a name, and then so on and so forth, and then your bind password or the user's password for this. The user doesn't have to be anything specific, no super user rights or anything like that. This typically would just be something that's a read-only user that has access and can bind to LDAP and do the lookups necessary to do things. And then the one thing that I forgot to mention here too is we'll need to specify a base DN. So the base DN tells us within LDAP, where are we going to go through and look for doing the searches for the queries for users. So the base DN is going to typically be the default of just the top of the list. But if you have your users and your groups in a certain area and you don't want to spend time doing the searches across your entirety of your environment, you can go through and specify to kind of restrict where we're going to go through and look up and where we're going to do those searches from. So you just specify that bind DN here, or that base DN there. And then with this here, we can go through and we need to talk about attribute mapping. So what attribute mapping is, it basically tells the cluster when I'm looking for these types of values that I'm searching. So things like, where do I find the GID number of a user? Where do I find the UID number? What is the format of the group entry or the group object look like, and what does it contain? We can go through and we specify that here. So the default mappings are generally going to be correct for most of the instances that are out there, especially if you're doing things with LDAP or with OpenLDAP. But you can go through and modify things. Maybe you're not specifying the UID number attribute for user objects to contain what their UID number is. Maybe you're using some other attribute like employee ID or something like that. You can specify and change these as you wish to go through and do that. So by default, let's say use the default. If you want to customize those, you can customize these. And if you're not sure, you can always come back and edit the connection and modify things as you need to after the fact. And we'll talk about in a bit how we go through and validate things once the connections have been made. So this kind of goes through again, talks about the basic LDAP fields and what their values are for this. This is outlined in the vast documentation for this, but I'm just going to kind of point out a few differences here between what you might see for the LDAP fields for OpenLDAP versus what we'd see for Active Directory here. Just some differences here with these here. So primary one here is that, what is the object class that we're using? Most cases for Active Directory, there's an object class that defines what kind of object is there. It's going to be a user object. Otherwise, with OpenLDAP, it's going to be a POSIX account. Same thing with the group or POSIX group, depending on which one you're using. But these are all, again, going to be very straightforward for these. Normally, the key ones we're looking for are going to be just make sure, hey, what is the attribute we're looking for GID number? What is the attribute we're looking for to give us a UID number? And then, maybe how is the member UID or how are the groups defined for them? So that's kind of the fields there. We'll also want to go through and we'll want to define the encryption method that we wish to use. So the encryption method, this is going to be how do we encrypt the connection, the LDAP connection from the VAST cluster to the OpenLDAP server. By default, this is set to none. This is the most compatible one. Unfortunately, it's not always the most secure. So I don't expect that a lot of you will go through and be using none as the encryption method. So you'll be using something either specifying start LDAP-S for the URL in the beginning, or you're going to go through and specify use encryption here of start TLS here for this, which will encrypt that connection there. If you need to go through, you need to specify a custom certificate to use for doing that connection or to validate that the LDAP server you're communicating to is the one that you're expecting. We can go through and accept TLS certificates here. So you can upload those TLS certificates as part of the initial configuration or modify them after the fact. So there are a couple other options here for this. Specifically, we'll talk about the authentication method that's used. So remember how I talked initially about specifying a bind DN, which is the user that is going to connect up, is going to be used to connect up to OpenLDAP. This will allow us to go through and change that. If you want to use an anonymous bind for that, we can use an anonymous bind for this. We can also use SASL binding for this as well. SASL changes some of the connection types there. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on explaining that here, but we can use SASL binding if we want for that. So you can select those here. And then another one here, and this is really more for if things don't work out initially, you may have to change things, is to talk about the group query mode. The group query mode is going to go through, and this is going to tell us how we're expecting the user objects and the group objects to be represented, how they're going to be defined. Specifically, are we using an RFC 2307 format, which means that the group object is the only thing that contains the user. So if you think about how traditional Linux and Unix do things, where you have your etc password file, which just contains the user and their primary group, and then the etc groups has the group name and then the users that are part of that group. But the etc password file doesn't contain any additional groups, just that primary one. So we've got that option here. We can search based on that. We can search based on the RFC 2307 BIS, which is going to be a variation of that, where it says that, the user object actually will have entries in there saying, oh, hey, they are a member of this group and this group and this group and this group for that. Or we can use a compatible lookup where we'll actually do both of those to get all the group membership for that. Normally I recommend, and this is the default, of leaving it set to compatible, but if you find that maybe there's some performance implications or performance issues with lookup, or we're not finding things properly, we can change those there. There is also an option here to go through and specify a group-based DN. This would be in a case where maybe your groups for your that are defined, the group objects are in a separate location than what the base DN is. So you specified that, hey, all of your users are going to be in the users OU, and all your groups are going to be in the group OU. You got two different ways that you guys specify your base DN to be at the high level that covers both of them, or you could specify your group base DN would be at the groups OU, and the base DN for users would be at the users OU. So we can control some of those. And there's some other options here talking about a DNS operation mode. This tells us how we go through and how and when the cluster does lookups of net groups and how it caches that information for them. And the final one here is a VMS authentication provider. And this VMS authentication provider is, this goes through, and we'll see this for OpenLDAP, we'll also see this for Active Directory. This will indicate that this LDAP connection will be used to query VMS users, so that when I log into VMS, or if I want to log into VMS, my username and password will be queried against this provider rather than relying on local users. So this is how you'd integrate into AD or OpenLDAP for VMS access. And we'll talk about that more as we go forward here. Okay, so very straightforward, very quickly with that. So let's move on to Active Directory. So Active Directory, we've got a couple different steps here that need to be done in order to join Active Directory. It's a two-step process within VAST. So we'll talk some of the requirements are here, which are a little different than what some of the other requirements might typically be in other platforms. But typically, we're going to need a user that has join rights. This is going to be a user that has administrator rights to do it. This may be a domain admin user or something. But basically, somebody has join rights. It could also be a user that has delegated access rights to a particular pre-created computer object. That's common in some environments where the network administrator or the Active Directory administrator will go through and create a computer object prior to VAST coming on, and will delegate that to a specific user, so they don't have to provide domain admin rights to create an object there. But we need to have a user. We need to know what the user is that can actually do the join, can go through and access that object or create a new object there. We'll also need, at least today, a separate service account. This is going to be a Windows. This is going to be a Windows account that's there. It just needs to be a read-only account. Should not have password expiration, and really only needs limited rights in AD. We really just need this to go through and use this for supplemental group lookups. This is something that eventually the VAST will go through and eliminate the need for, but and just rely strictly on the computer account to do these kind of lookups. But today we require a separate service account. So we can use either define the full DN for this, or use the UPN, so user at domain, if we use SASL for configuration for this. But we really need to have this so that there isn't a password expiration on this for it. If there is a situation where this account becomes locked or this account has a password expiration, user lookups will begin to fail for any new access that's coming in, or if we have to go through and refresh cached access information. So it's really important that this account doesn't change very much. And then we'll also need the name of the domain. So I mean, well, what is the Active Directory domain we're going to go through and do? So this, and when we do the join, it's going to be done in 2 steps. First off is just going to be the initial configuration, where we're going to validate a few things, and we can see the DCs. We can use this. We can connect up with this service account for that, and then there's the actual join, where we'll utilize this administrator account to do the join. So let's kind of walk through some of the steps here for this. So with this, we can use up to 8 Active Directory providers can be on here. Again, these Active Directory providers can be used by multiple tenants for that, but we're going to configure 1 per tenant. But we can support up to 8 different Active Directory providers for this. So we will go through, and any of these AD environments can either be part of the same forest, or they can be completely independent of each other. The requirement is that any of the domain controllers, any of those domains, have to be resolvable and accessible and routable from the VAST management network, at least for today as a VAST 5.2. So if we want to go through, we want to create a new Active Directory connection, we'll go into Active Directory, we're going to user management, Active Directory, we'll say create AD, and we're going to be presented with some basic fields here. Basic fields are going to be the ones you'd expect. Here's the domain that we're going to go through and join. We need to provide a computer account name that we're going to use. So this computer account can be the cluster name. It could be really anything that you want it to be, but it has to be, we need to define the computer account that we wish to have created within Active Directory. This would be, if we're talking about straight Windows terms, this would be kind of the equivalent of what is the workstation account that we're doing the join. What is your workstation named when you join Active Directory? That is the computer object there. But within VAST, we're joining the cluster itself, so we can set this as we need to. If we wish to specify the organizational unit, meaning where do we want to have this object placed, we can go through and specify that. This applies to if we're creating new objects. If we're using existing objects, we can just leave this blank and we'll find the object out there wherever it happens to be. And then if we need to specify a port, generally we don't need to specify a port. For this, it's very rare that we actually have to specify a specific port to use for it. We can specify that here. So normally just leave this blank, or just leave it in the grayed out state, which means that we're not specifying anything. And then here we would specify our bind DN that we're going to go through and use in the password. So again, this bind DN can either be the LDAP syntax for the user that's doing the bind DN, or it can be a user principal entry and then their password for this service account. If you happen to not be sure of what the bind DN is for the user, you can use a DS query command to do this. You can also do a who am I command /fqdn to get that full bind DN. You can go through and look this up within the attributes for those there. So you can get that information that way if you wish to. Again, like like OpenLDAP, we can do custom attribute mapping for this. These attributes will default to what the RFC 2307 attributes are defined for Active Directory for that, as well as the computer objects or the object types within Active Directory to go through and do these lookups. So as you'll see here, the UID or the username for this will default to the SAM account name. We're going to search for different things using SAM account name for this, but look for UID number and GID number attributes to get those there. So again, we'll break down kind of a breakdown here of what each one of these are for this. Very similar again to what the OpenLDAP ones are, just using different attributes because Active Directory is defined a little bit different than OpenLDAP. One thing I haven't mentioned here is that there is an attribute on here called match user. Some of you with sharp eyes may have seen this attribute list on here, but there is an attribute here called match user. Okay, what match user is used for is we use match user to go through and help us stitch together different providers to establish commonality of users between the different providers. So what this means is that this is how I will identify a user from Active Directory to a user in OpenLDAP. Now, match user isn't going to be used if I have all the attributes in one location. So if I have Active Directory, I've got my RFC 2307 attributes, so the user object in Active Directory has UID number and GID number already. The match user variable doesn't matter. But if I have only my Windows SID and things like that in Active Directory, but I don't have a Unix UID number at all in Active Directory, and I need to get that from OpenLDAP, I need a method to say, hey, this user over here in Active Directory is this user in OpenLDAP. And we use that using the match user variable. So the match user variable defines an attribute whose value is going to match the equivalent match user attribute in the other provider. So the defaults here are going to be SAM account name for Active Directory and UID for OpenLDAP. So what this says is that when I do a lookup, and we'll use my username as an example, when I come through and I come in over SMB, I'm going to provide my Windows SID on the connection. For that, the Windows SID is going to look up, going to be looked up in Active Directory along with some authentication things that happen. I'm very much oversimplifying things, but we'll take that SID and we'll say, hey, this is user Phil. Okay, or user Phil. And we're going to go through and look at that and say, well, Phil's user information has this, and his SAM account name is PWAGs. And we're going to go through and we're going to look at that and say, oh, hey, the match user variable here, we're going to look at that object. We're going to not see any Unix information, but oh, hey, I see this match user variable. Match user is SAM account name. Oh, okay, so I know I'm going to take PWAGs here. Oh, I also have an OpenLDAP provider configured in this tenant, and I want to use that to get the Unix attributes. So I look at the OpenLDAP provider and I say, okay, well, what's the match user variable here? Oh, that's UID. Okay, so I'm going to take the SAM account name value of PWAGs, and I'm going to use that to search for a UID in OpenLDAP that is PWAGs. And it says, oh, hey, this is my user ID number. My user ID number is 12345 for this. So my primary group is for 12345 for that. It says, oh, okay, well, now the system knows that, okay, the Unix UID number of 12345 is the same as user PWAGs, which is the same as the Windows user PWAGs, which is me, and that is that SID. So this will be treated as the same user across both protocols. So we can go through and we can define, which one is the primary for that. So maybe if there's a case where I've got, the Unix attributes defined in both, and I'm in migration, I can define which one is going to be the POSIX primary for that. But we'll use this match user to go through and match those two together and stitch those two providers together to give us that cross protocol identities. Now, the one thing you might ask here is, well, how does S3 play into this? S3 has access keys and user and secret keys with that. Well, when we go through and we define the S3 key, it's associated with user, so it actually is going to be associated with both those. It's not something that has to be looked up within either AD or OpenLDAP. It's defined on the system, and we already know that information. So it doesn't need to be. We don't need to define a match user variable for S3. Moving on here with that, again, like OpenLDAP, we need to define encryption. Again, it defaults to none. We definitely would not recommend you leave that there. You'll want to go through and change this to either use start TLS or LDAP-S, and this will go through and automatically change the port that is used for those connections to either 636 and 389, depending on what you have set there. So you can go through and change the encryption. Definitely recommend that you go through and change it from the default to none. And then the last portion, a couple other portions here, this is a new option here for starting with 5.2, is to go through and do a password renewal. So certain environments have a requirement to go through and update the machine account password. This is different from the service account password that we're utilizing for group lookups. The machine account password is used more for Kerberos authentication and connections like that. So we can go through and set the ability to rotate and automatically refresh the machine account password within a certain period of time. For that, so you can go through and turn that on if you have security requirements within your environment that require that rotation of the machine account password. And then the last portion of this under advanced, there's a couple options in here. So first off is that we can go through, we can control, do I want to enable trusted domains and other force for this? So this means that if we have one-way trust or two-way trust, do I want to allow the system to go through and search those and do lookups in there and either authorize or authenticate users from those other force or not? NTLM, if I want to go through and I want to enable or disable NTLM authentication, I can go through and do that. If I disable NTLM authentication, we'll rely strictly on Kerberos authentication. So there are security requirements. For what your security requirements are in your environment, you can either turn on or turn off the ability to use NTLM authentication with those. VMS authentication provider, we've already talked about that. We also have in here filters here. This is a more complex configuration if you want. You set some filters for how we're looking up users and things like that. NetGroup DNS operation mode, we already talked about that. Authentication method, we've already mentioned that. Query group mode and POSIX attribute source are something else that is new here. So POSIX attribute source just says for RFC 2307 attributes in Active Directory, where do we want to look those up? So typically there is no guarantee or there's no requirement with an Active Directory that if you have RFC 2307 attributes or you have UID number and GID number, that there is no enforced rule within Active Directory that says that, hey, that has to be unique across all domains. So this tells us here, because of that, we have some controls as to where we're doing lookups, because we don't want to find that I've got a UID number that is mapping to two users. We want to keep that just to a single user so we'll always know which user it is. And this allows us to control, do we want to just do the look for those attributes in the domain we're joined in, or do I want to do globally within the forest or only specific domains we control those there. And again, for this here, some options here. So we can see here that I've got a couple of different domains. I can say which specific domains I wish to go through and use for that, or just leave it to join domain that I'm part of. All right, so once we've got that set up, we're going to see kind of this setup here. We're going through, we've got the Active Directory connection defined, but we're going to see that we're going to be in a connected state, which means that that service account has validated that, yep, that's a valid account. It can authenticate, it can do lookups, but we're still not a member of the domain. We haven't actually gone through and established that join yet. So when we want to go through and we want to do the join, we just go through and right-click on this and say join. And the join, again, is going to require that we provide a different username and password. Again, it's either going to be a domain administrator, means someone that has the ability to create a new computer object in AD, or it's going to be a user that has delegated authority to an existing object to use that. We just provide the username, provide the password, and it goes off and does that. Either it'll succeed or you'll get an error saying why it didn't succeed. Maybe you had the incorrect password or some other reason there for that, but usually goes pretty smoothly and just takes a few seconds to complete. Once we've joined, then we've got a couple different options here we can go through to validate that we see what we expect to see within the domain or within the Active Directory environment. So we can go through and make some modifications for the existing connection. I can either turn on or off NTLM. I can go through, I can edit this and modify my attributes if I need to for my attribute mapping. We can change things there just by right-clicking and modifying that connection. So kind of an example here, if I want to see other domains that are in the forest, I can go through and right-click and say, hey, show me all the domains. And this will give me a listing of all the domains that we have within the forest. It'll also include any domains that are part of a two-way trust for that. So we'll see all the domains that the system is aware of across those. So very, very quick way to validate saying, hey, am I seeing all the things that I expect to see, or is there possibly some communication issue for that? We can also go through and see the DCs that are available to us. Now, this is not necessarily always going to be a complete list of all the DCs in the environment. Typical large Active Directory environments may contain hundreds or even thousands of domain controllers on here. This is going to be a subset of those DCs, but what it is going to go through and include, it's going to include the local DCs along with a few select other ones from the queries that we made to AD to get a listing of those. So we'll see, the name of the DC that's out there. We'll see the state of the DC. Is it a healthy DC? And then we'll also see, is it something that's on site? Meaning, is this something that is part of the same Active Directory site that we are part of? Now, health is usually, the state of the DC is typically going to be healthy for this. If there's a problem communicating with that DC, it'll be some error condition. A lot of cases you may see this unknown state, and this unknown state really, it doesn't indicate that there's an error with that DC. It just means that it's a DC we haven't talked to yet, or we haven't had a reason to go communicate to, so we really just don't know the state of it, and we're not going to spend a lot of time trying to troubleshoot that or go through and connect to it because we don't need to talk to it. Most of the times we're going to go through, we're going to stick with the local Active Directory site because those are the DCs that basically have the shortest cost to contact or the smallest cost to contact because they're local to us. So we'll see those as healthy and on-site. We may see a couple other ones that we've communicated to through some of the DC locator code that we use. But most of the other ones on there that are not on-site will just have a state of unknown because we haven't attempted to talk to those with that. So nothing to be concerned about with that. We can also see some other information here as to whether which global catalogs are available. A global catalog, if you're not familiar with what global catalog is a subset of your AD infrastructure that lives on a DC, but it basically will contain information of all the domains for that. So we provide this as just troubleshooting method there, and it tells us which ones we see out there, what their states are for that, and when we're to go through and do a refresh. And we'll refresh this list about once an hour normally. So with that, that's Active Directory, at least connectivity in a nutshell. So let's talk very basically about NIS. NIS is ridiculously simple in our case here. We're talking about YP NIS, not NIS Plus for that. For those customers that do support, that do need NIS or still use NIS, we definitely do support it. For NIS, really, we just ask for a little bit of information. We need to know the NIS domain name, and we need to know the IP address of the NIS servers. We don't do broadcast for NIS, meaning we're not going to go out and search for NIS servers. We're going to require that you provide a list. So define the domain name for NIS, provide the NIS servers we want, and say create, and we'll connect up and join NIS that way. So we have these providers that have already been set up now. So we have typically we have one or two for OpenLDAP. We may have some for Active Directory. We may have one for NIS. So how do we put these together? How do we define which ones we want to use for a particular tenant? As I said, these are defined cluster-wide. Well, to begin with, first off, if you're not using multi-tenancy, you don't have any additional tenants defined, when you add Active Directory, that's automatically going to be configured into the default tenant. Or when you add the first OpenLDAP provider, it's automatically going to be configured into the default tenant. But if you have more than one tenant, you need to define which ones you wish to use. So again, you assign the providers to the tenants, and these again are going to be the combinations that we support for this. But when you go through, you go under Element Store Tenants, and you'll be presented with a list of providers to go through and use. Now, the GUI has changed slightly depending on the version that you're using, so this screen may look a little bit different, but we go through and we select which Active Directory provider we wish to use, which LDAP provider we wish to use for this tenant, which NIS provider we wish to use. This is all going to be a drop-down menu for this, so we select which AD tenant, which LDAP tenant we may want to use, select those there. We can select which one is the one to provide the login name information. Again, this is going to be the UPN for this. If we want to rely on AD or we want to rely on LDAP, we can do that. And then which one do we want to use for that POSIX primary provider. So if I do have UID numbers in both OpenLDAP and Active Directory for the same user, which one are we going to go through and use? In the cases for a POSIX primary provider, if we don't, if I have attributes in only one or the other, we're going to use whatever attributes we find. It doesn't matter what the POSIX primary provider. This just says that, hey, if I've got conflicts for a user or there's disagreements as to one or the other, which is going to be the source of truth for. And that's it. So we define that there. So once we've got this defined within a tenant, and we've got this defined defined within a cluster, and we've selected our providers and added them to a tenant, how do we validate things work before we start throwing users at it? And we can do this through VMS. VMS provides a very nice way to go through and do this. So we can do this either through the VCLI. For this, I'm going to show this through the GUI. It's much simpler to use. But we can do this through the GUI, where we go through and we say, hey, I'm going to go into my user management, go into users, and I'm going to say query for user. And when I do that query, it's going to ask us, well, how do you want to query for that user? Do you want to use their UID or their UID number? Do we want to query based on their Windows SID? Do you want to query based on their username or basically their short username? Do you want to query based on their login name or their UPN information? So we can select any one of those. And then we can also select which tenant we're going to do this query against. So if I've got multiple tenants on there and I've got multiple configurations there, we need to specify how I want to do that query based on this tenant's configuration for this. And in the context, and we'll go into this in just seconds, what the context is, but the context says how specific do I want to be with this query, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So the context here is that, again, if we have multiple providers, which ones do we want to do this query against? Normally, so we can go through and specify, hey, I only want to use the locally created users. So let's say I want to look up a UID number, but I only look for locally defined users that I've manually created on the VAST cluster. Or if I want to just query against OpenLDAP, I can do a query against OpenLDAP only without looking at Active Directory. Or if I want to query just Active Directory, I can just query AD, or I can use aggregate. Now, this is just for doing the query, and normally where we'd select different providers, looking at the context would be for troubleshooting purposes, but the normal lookup that happens is going to be in an aggregated sense. So again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, when we look up user attributes for users, we're going to consult all the providers that are configured for this, and that's how we're going to operate. But in some cases, if you're trying to figure out, oh, hey, why am I not getting a UID number, or I'm not getting a Windows SID, or I'm not getting all the groups that I expect, we may need to go through and say, I want to do a query against one provider by itself, and just say, hey, can I do a lookup in this provider? Maybe I've got the wrong match user value, or I'm looking for the wrong attributes. So we can use that to isolate things down. But normal operation mode is going to be the equivalent of aggregated, where all the providers are consulted. So we provide that. In this case here, I'm going to go through and I'm going to query for a user called DCLDAP1 in an aggregated context against the tenant Alpha Industries here. So it's going to go out and look at those users, and I'm going to get back a result for that user. So in the aggregated sense, I'm going to get back a combined list of all the attributes that I found from all the providers, and it will actually tell me how it found that user. So I did a lookup of the username DCLDAP1, and I can see that, oh, hey, this user has a UID of 3071. It's got a Windows SID of this Windows SID. It's part of these groups. But it's going to tell me here, too, where it found that information. So it said, hey, I found this user DCLDAP1 in OpenLDAP, and that's where I got the UID number. But I found their Windows SID in Active Directory, and here's their Windows SID. And their leading group, or their primary Unix group, I found that in LDAP. What you'll see here, though, is that the groups here is going to be a combination of all the groups from both providers. So if I've got groups that only exist in AD, or I've got groups that only exist in LDAP, we're going to put all those together. And when we're trying to determine group access or permissions for group access, we're going to use that combined list. So it doesn't tell us where it got these, but it tells us all the groups that it found. And you'll see this not only within the VMS GUI, but also through the VCLI. In some cases, if you're trying to do group lookups and group troubleshootings here, the GUI does tend to go through and truncate things after a certain number of entries. Whereas if you do the query using a command called user query on the command line, it'll give you a complete list of all the groups, even if this is 1,000 groups for this. And then incidentally here, if we need to go through and generate an S3 key for a user, we could generate our S3 keys for our user here. Now, so with that would give us all of our information for our users. And at that point, that's really all that needs to be done. We're able to go through and identify our users. They're able to access. We're able to do multi-protocol for those there. We need to go through and configure our views and view policies to go through and set up the protocol access. But our users should be pretty well set. So let's move on here. Let's talk about VMS RBAC. So as I mentioned before, there is a variable that can be set is that we may want to go through and leverage our existing infrastructure, be it Active Directory or OpenLDAP, to allow access to VMS, to do administration on the cluster. Now, this does not mean that just by doing this that I'm going to allow every single user in the environment to go through and connect to the VAST and administer the VAST. This just means we'll be able to use this provider, and for the groups that I define, we will allow them to administer the cluster, and we can use our passwords that are in Active Directory or in LDAP to gain that access. So we do this with a couple of things. So when we go through and configure VMS RBAC, we configure this based on groups. So we don't enable individual users from Active Directory or individual users from OpenLDAP. We define groups that are allowed, and then we define rights that those groups have. So you have a group that already exists. You can say, like, your VAST admins group. I want to use a VAST admin group, so I'm going to give them this amount of rights. You can do that. That way, as you add additional users to that VAST admin group, so you don't have to change anything on the VAST side. We'll just go through, and when the user connects up, we'll say, oh, hey, they're part of the VAST admin group, and they can go through and administer VMS through that. The passwords are managed via your existing methods, so we're not managing any passwords locally on the VAST. We're going to rely on Active Directory or LDAP for that. And as such, if the account is locked in Active Directory, they're going to be locked out of VMS as well. So very, very simple for them. So when we go through and we want to enable a provider, we go through and we edit the provider, and under advanced, there's going to be this VMS authentication provider. By default, we don't turn this on for any provider. So if you want to enable this, you need to go through and edit it, click VMS authentication provider, turn that on. And then the only other requirement is that this provider needs to be configured as part of a tenant. Even if the tenant isn't used for anything else, it needs to be configured as part of a tenant. Now, there are going to be some changes coming up when it comes to VAST 5.3, where we start introducing some multi-tenant VMS abilities with that. So those rules will change slightly coming with 5.3, but the provider needs to be configured as part of a tenant in order to be able to use that to access VMS. It can't just be a provider by itself, configured at the cluster level, that isn't used by any tenant. So as a caution here, again, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that we have this connection encrypted. So for OpenLDAP, make sure you're using TLS, or for Active Directory, make sure you're using TLS for encryption, or you're using SASL for encryption, or LDAP-S for the connection, to make sure that those are encrypted. So with that here, we go through, if I want to go through and I want to enable this within VMS, we just said, okay, this provider is going to be used for checking users. We need now to define how those users have access. So we do that via a defined role. VAST does have several defined roles. for this. So we can configure these default roles. We can go through. We can add groups to the default roles if we want, but we can't modify the existing default roles in terms of their permissions. So I'm going to talk about how we create a new role. So the new role is going to go through, and we edit the role itself, or we create a new role for this. And we can select which realms we want to give them access and what kind of rights we want to give them access to. And then under here for the Open Active Directory LDAP groups, we just need to start providing the group name. So what you'll see here is I start typing in the group here, it will start to autocomplete, give you a list of things. So as I start typing domain, it's going to give me domain admins, domain controllers, domain guests, domain users there. I need to select which one I need to use for this. Once I click on that, and it highlights in a nice oval on that, then we'll do that. We hit update, and we're good to go. Same thing with creating a new role. Create a new role, define the name for it, define which realms and the rights we want to use, the Active Directory groups we want to use, and click Create, and it'll create those. So let's talk about what these different realms are and what they allow for. So these realms are relatively coarse in terms of definition. They do allow quite a few things for this. So events is going to include things like how do we manage the alarms and events in the system? Do they have the ability to create new alarms or configure the alarms or disable alarms for that? Hardware includes hardware access. I want to allow them to update or add devices to the cluster or add additional C nodes and D boxes and things like that. Logical is a very big realm. Logical encompasses creating things like views and view policies and quotas and VIP pools for that. Very, very, very broad for that. Monitoring includes anything related to analytics. Security is going to be going through and configuring the managers and the roles for that. Settings are other miscellaneous settings, and support is going to control the support-related function. Can I create views? Can I create can I create bundles? What operations do I have there? Starting with 5.2, we've got the ability to go through and customize these realms. So we can create new realms with custom definitions for them. So again, like with the logical realm, we may want to cut that down. Maybe I just want to create a quota administrator type role for someone. So I can do that. I'll just go through and say, tell it to create a new realm. And then I will select which entities I want to use. So here, if I wanted to be a quota administrator, I say, hey, I want to use my quota entry info, my quota, user quota entries there. I can give them just rights to those. And we can create the realm for that. And then the way that looks here is that when we go through, we would see that realm showing up here. For this, we'd see a custom role underneath this, or custom realm underneath this. We're going to add those in. And again, as I said, we can go through and create and define what types of rights. Are they allowed to create new things like create new VIP pools? Are they just allowed to view existing ones? Are they allowed to edit existing ones? Are they allowed to delete things? So we control those there. And then finally, the last part is with the login process. Really, the login process for VMS is that we'll go through, we'll attempt to bind into the provider for this when someone logs in and do their group lookups and things like that. And if they're allowed to go through and bind, we'll store that information for 10 minutes. But that's, we're not doing constant queries of things for that. So very quick, very simple to go through and do that. So with that, that is the conclusion of the overview of user and provider management, how we integrate an Active Directory and LDAP and things there. So I appreciate your time this morning. And with that, we'll be able to go through and take any questions that you have. Please feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll go from there. So thank you for your time.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining today. And as you've heard, we have gone through quite a few things. We've talked about networking. We've talked about user management. Now we're going to go into views and view policies in our next webinar coming up. So really helping you understand, how to set up everything. You heard a lot today about the who, getting those people in to be able to use VMS. So with that, I will conclude. We're going to put some information for you in the chat as far as next steps for registering for an upcoming webinar. You will get this recording in addition to some slides and also that link to register. Again, thank you all for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.